Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, everyone. Dylan in the host chair again for yet another adventure in the What If Machine. I have two distinguished gentlemen with me today, as usual. I have the one, the only, Mr. Evan Buck.
Hey, everyone. How's it going? It's your boy, Evan.
And a man who needs no introduction, and yet I shall give him one.
Hi, good people.
All right, we've got Chris Capone in the house, everyone. It is officially a Fork in Time episode. We're going to take a break from our, what turns out, I realized when I was listening to the episode the other day, a very party realignment 1920s and 30s focused kind of month or two we've had. It's weird we somehow managed to do two forks that kind of are developing along the same, almost identical lines in concept, if not in the particular players.
But only one of them has triggered me to threaten a one-man show.
I don't know if threaten may be an accurate description at this point. It may you're like Thanos. You've become inevitable.
Yeah, pretty much.
Oh, you can hear the snap. Chris just snapped his fingers at the mic. All right, half of our episodes are officially wiped out.
Yeah, for real. The quirks of recording and releasing made that possible.
Yeah. So today we're going to take a little bit of break from U.S. Electoral College and political processes, and we're going to go further back in time than we tend to do. We are going to go all the way back to the year 1492, when a good man named Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue. We're going to explore a world where Columbus does not, and I'm going to use the next word in very heavy air quotes, discover America. So
the Vikings have something to say about that.
Yeah, the Vikings and a certain member of Columbus's own crew have something to say about that. So the gist is, everybody kind of knows the story. 1492, Italian Cristoforo Colombo begs the Portuguese unsuccessfully, and then goes to then King and Queen Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, which is not actually Spain. It's actually a dual monarchy, almost like the Habsburg Austrian-Hungarian monarchy, kind of joint rule situation of Castile and Aragon, which are the other two primary kingdoms of Spain at the point. Ferdinand and Isabella are just about wrapping up their reconquista of Granada and kind of the last bits of Andalusian Muslim Spain, which we've done in several previous episodes. So Ferdinand and Isabella are kind of riding high. They decide to finance Columbus, so he leaves Spain with three ships, whose names I will give you now because they're not what you would remember from the nursery rhyme. The Santa Maria, the Santa Clara, which is nicknamed the Nina, and a ship whose nickname passes down to history as the Pinta, but whose real name is unknown. But the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria has a whole lot more of a ring to it than the Santa Clara, the Santa Maria, and some ship we've forgotten the name of. Anyway, Columbus shoots off across the Atlantic with these three ships, and he's kind of winding his way. One fun fact about this voyage that I discovered is that Columbus was a very crafty navigator. He actually had two sets of travelogues. One of the reasons why he'd been kicked out of Portugal is because he thought that the journey was only going to take 2,400 miles, which is about it's about a third of what the actual distance is from Portugal to the New World. So Columbus was basically predicting this could be done in a third of the distance. So Columbus had two travelogues. One, he would keep track of the actual distance they were going. And a second one he had for the sailors, where he basically cut the numbers down by about a third, just in case any of them saw just how far out in the Atlantic they were and decided to freak out.
And I'll also throw in here as well, these ships, you think of these ships as big, seafaring, able to make a journey of this caliber. I was having a conversation with somebody at church today, and they basically reminded me These ships were actually quite diminutive in nature. They were quite small compared to a lot of the, standard seafaring Voyager ships of the day. So if you're a sailor on this ship and you catch wind of the fact that you're actually going way further than the ship was supposed to go and stated to go and designed to go, you might have some issues with that.
Yeah. This is an age where any kind of adventure is really an adventure. Like, you don't know, this is quite literally sort of Here Be Dragons territory on the map. And that's basically what Columbus's guys kind of know they're heading into. So they leave kind of the Canary Islands in September. And basically for the next 29 days, they do not see land. So they're gone for almost an entire month without any sight of land whatsoever. On October, in our timeline, on October 9th or 10th, depending on your dating and the records you're looking at, Columbus's sailors threaten a mutiny. They say, we're tired of this. We want to go back to Spain. Columbus manages to talk them down, and he basically gives them a deal. He says, hey, if we don't sight land for 3 days, we'll turn back. We'll call it quits. We'll go back to Spain. Enough's enough. The next day, Columbus thinks he sees light in the distance. Actually, no, sorry. I'm getting my dates. There's too many October dates about stuff that happens on this voyage. In our timeline, 2 days before this mutiny promise, Columbus and the crew sight a bunch of birds flying. They're kind of seabirds, sort of island seabirds. There's a couple theories about what kind of birds they are, but we won't go into it. And Columbus takes this as a signal because these birds are flying southwest. Well, seabirds tend to fly towards land. You kind of make the assumption is they got to go back home to roost. So Columbus decides to change his course to west southwest. He's basically heading straight west. He kind of ducks south a little bit. That decision actually ends up saving him 4 days from now, on the morning of the third day, before he is about to have to turn around. Columbus, quote unquote, sights land, which is another story I'll get into in a little bit. So Columbus finds land. He lands on the island of San Salvador in the Bahamas, and quote unquote discovers the New World. Now, the reason I say quote unquote sights new land is because actually the night before, one of his sailors had actually found the first sight of land. It's like 2 o'clock in the morning. Rodrigo de Triana gets the actual sighting that's confirmed by the guy in the crow's nest that sees land. Columbus had claimed he quote unquote saw lights in the distance like 5-6 hours before that. So, long story at the end, Columbus goes back to Spain. Ferdinand and Isabella had promised a 10,000 malavides. I'm probably mispronouncing that. Basically an annual pension to whoever sighted land. Columbus, wanting that sweet, sweet money for himself, basically throws Rodrigo under the bus and says, hey, I totally saw land first, even though nobody can corroborate it. I was the guy. I get it. So Columbus got $4,000 a year for the rest of his life because he cheated poor Rodrigo de Triana out of sighting land. Anyway, our fork is, what if these sailors get this promise out of Columbus a couple days early? So basically, the sailors threatened a mutiny just a couple of days. Maybe instead of 29 days without land, they're like, you know what, 26 is good enough. We're tired. We don't want to go a whole month without land. So they get the 3-day promise is exactly the same. They get it from Columbus, but it's not enough time for Columbus, even with this change of course, to get to San Salvador before he has to turn around and head back home. So that's our fork. Columbus is forced to head home with his tail between his legs. Gentlemen, what do we think happens next?
Well, I'm just going to say probably the most obvious impact of this fork is we don't have Columbus Day and we don't have Indigenous Peoples Day as a result. If we have Indigenous Peoples Day, it's a different day altogether, but it's certainly not in response to the voyage and the landing of Christopher Columbus. I personally feel that having this expedition go south, I mean, obviously it tanks, Columbus's sailing, captaining career. Like he's a great navigator, and everybody, anybody who is everybody at that point would remember Columbus as a good navigator. But in this alternate timeline, he would just be a footnote that nobody modern era would even remember his name. He would only be a footnote as, just a stepping stone to whenever the quote unquote new world was actually discovered. We would remember who actually reached the new world first in lieu of Columbus way more than we would remember him. I think that some other things that we should, that we can think about and discuss as well is no discovery of the new world in 1492 when that takes place in our timeline. You take that out, and that obviously has huge downstream effects of no Columbian exchange, which, the Columbian exchange is basically the exchange of diseases and crops and all of these things that come back and forth between the Americas and Europe. If we delay that, by a few years, couple decades, a century, whatever, how does this impact the development of Native American indigenous societies? And I'm kind of throwing just as something to throw
You're
out.
kind of
before we
fast
really
forwarding
get into
towards the
this.
end of the episode.
We're fast forwarding towards the end of the episode here. I'm throwing these out to kind of set things up because this is a topic that has such broad implications that it's kind of difficult to really kind of wrap your arms around which one to tackle first. So I'm just kind of throwing out some ideas.
Yeah.
Well,
and kind of developing what we'll get into eventually. But
somebody's
got to discover America.
Somebody's going to.
So
Somebody's
this
going to.
exchange is going to happen.
Yeah. It's just a
100,
question of
100%.
how delayed is it, who does it, and what does that change in terms of the development depending on who does it and where.
And the nature, this is kind of what I'm trying to get at with the nature of the exchange. It happens the way it does. A big part of that reason why it does in our timeline is because we basically have, the burning boats incident, right? Where basically the conquistadors come ashore and we're like, come hell or high water, we're either dying or conquering this land. We're staying here. And so as a result, they conquer a lot of what is now known today as, Latin America, and all of, the British coming over with the British colonies, all of that. The mass migration that occurs, I think is a big reason why this Columbian exchange happens the way it does, or the way it ultimately ends up doing so. If it's a much more piecemeal thing, like here and there, whoever discovers it, brings small quantities, for me, my immediate thought was, would this possibly give time for the Native Americans to develop immunity, or at least some kind of way for their systems to fight back against these European diseases? That I think is really interesting.
First, I think that the other thing that I was thinking about is Spain was at a really interesting point when Columbus sailed in terms of the Reconquista. They had a ton of military trained personnel so that as soon as they discover the new world, they're on top of them. And what you see in specifically New Spain, Mexico, Peru, those areas, first you have the shock of the Columbian exchange, i.e. like smallpox, and immediately you have a ton of...
You have a military follow-up directly after it.
Immediately. And depending upon how the discovery happens, one, I don't think that happens, and two, I think if you have the biological wave, because I think that is part of the Columbian, the biological
100%.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Do native societies have a chance to have that pass through? And then what does that do in terms of, do you have other polities emerging from within native societies that are then better able to meet the Europeans at the water's edge?
Yeah, because I think one of the things that gave Spain an advantage in the sort of Columbian exchange, particularly the disease front, is
It's guns, germs, and steel.
It's literally guns, germs, and steel, but it is also a metaphorical shotgun start, because once Spain gets to the Caribbean, it's not hard to send, De Soto, Cortez, all the other guys. You can literally just basically give each guy a boat and point him in a different variation of west, and they're going to land in 16 different places. So the just from a pure kind of virological, pathological perspective, that gives so many more transmission vectors for disease to spread, because you have multiple exposure points between Spaniards who carry these diseases and Native Americans, indigenous people who are not inoculated against them. If you have either or discovery not in the Caribbean, in someplace else that makes that shotgun start more difficult, or discovery by somebody else later, that changes the whole trajectory, at least at the beginning. Probably long term, you still have, maybe not 90%, but probably 80% of the indigenous population of the Americas maybe gets wiped out. But the way that it happens and the sort of curve of the population decline could look completely different. And I guess that gets us to the first big question that we have to figure out is, if Columbus isn't going to do it, who is, and what flag is he going to sail under? I kind of have my favorite horse, but there's a bunch of options that we could pick here.
Who? I mean, I'm gonna throw out that I think one of the biggest things that happens as a result of this is there's as I write in my document a couple of times for preparation of the show, I think there's a chilling effect in terms of wanting to sail west. Because if Christopher Columbus, who's one of the most respected navigators, might not be a great people manager, might not be a good CEO, but he's good at what he can do. If he's not able to get there, this basically, I think, for at least a little while in the European consciousness is like, maybe his idea of trying to sail west to get to India really wasn't a great idea. So I'll throw in here something as well. When we learn this story in, elementary school, middle school, whatever, there's this very popular idea that, nobody wanted Christopher Columbus to sail west because they thought that he was going to fall off the edge of the world.
Yeah, completely gone by this point.
Yeah, that's actually not accurate. That's not true. There's other reasons why they didn't want him to sail west.
It's expensive as crap.
Because it's expensive as heck. But no, it's not because they thought he was going to fall off the edge of the planet. He had a good reason. If you think of most people at that point thought of the world as spherical. And so, if there's nothing in the way there, yeah, it might be a longer way to get to China, and India, but you will, just as a law of nature, are going to get there if you sail west enough. The whole issue was, how west is west?
And just to kind of, you say you'll get there if you sail west enough, but just to kind of remind us about what you were saying about the ships. There is kind of a distance at which, these ships can't actually go that far.
Yeah.
Let's be real honest. I'm not even sure these ships could have crossed the Pacific.
Yeah. I doubt that. I based on what I've learned, I doubt that. So I think there's a big chilling effect in terms of wanting to sail west. And as we kind of talked about in the pre-discussion on the podcast, I think with the Portuguese discovering, around the Cape of Good Hope with Southern Africa, a route to India, I think that at least for a little while, European attention is directed more towards the east. And, Dylan, you had some interesting thoughts and developments on, this is still technically part of the New World of the West, but nobody at that point knew that it's connected to this larger landmass to the north.
Exactly.
So Dylan, how about you? I think this is a good time to delve into that. And I'm just going to say, I don't think the Portuguese, they're going to be one of the last people to want to sail west because they already have a route to the east. And as what Dylan will talk about, there's a good reason for them to develop the eastern areas.
Yeah. So the Portuguese kind of, actually, ironically enough, have kind of beaten. So the Spanish get all the credit in the age of exploration because they discover America, which is basically the giant gold mine in the west of both literally and metaphorically of exploration. The Portuguese at this point have already figured out how to get around Africa, which is the whole point of this whole thing. You know, Columbus was sailing west to find a route to the Indies, basically the Orient, Indonesia, China, all of the stuff that the Ottomans had just kicked them out of being able to get by taking over most of the Middle East, and basically taking over, putting a chokehold on most of the ancient Silk Road that all the Europeans wanted their spice to be able to flavor things with. Now, the Portuguese, Vasco da Gama, I think in 1488, 1488, Vasco da Gama reaches India around the Cape, and everybody realizes, oh, this is a thing that can actually be done. So the Portuguese are basically hopscotching down the western coast of Africa, while Columbus has this madcap idea of what if we just go straight west and see what happens? So the Portuguese, they're full focused on, they've got a bunch of ports kind of bouncing around Western Africa. They have basically what amounts to a full-fledged colony in Namibia. And that's what they're doing. They're focused on trying to get around the Horn of Africa, around the Cape, go up to India, get their spices that way, and come all the way back. What's really interesting is, I think, and this is just my personal, favorite horse in this race of who discovers America, I actually think the Portuguese, even though they have the least intention to do it, are the first people to discover America. And the reason why is because that's how they discovered America. In 1500, one of the guys that Vasco da Gama had on a couple of his expeditions, Pedro Alvarez Cabral, happens to get his own expedition. And he's basically planning to do the same thing da Gama did, jump around the Cape, go up the Horn, go to India. He gets blown off course. And he lands in some place that currently does not, but very soon will, speak Portuguese in South America. Cabral discovers Brazil. So I think that's kind of the natural discovery of America route, at least me, because Cabral's still going to be doing his same route, whether Columbus discovers America or not. He's still probably going to get blown off course by the same trade winds because they're there no matter what happens. So I think Cabral actually becomes credited as the accidental discoverer of what they don't think of as necessarily the West Indies. But Cabral did think that Brazil was some kind of island. And if he sailed around it, he would eventually get to the Indies. So I think Brazil kind of becomes the sort of new world, quote unquote. And so I think you start seeing at least the Portuguese, because they have this kind of locus on the western side of Africa, the Portuguese are going to kind of use it as another stepping stone on their way to the Indies around Africa. The question, I think, then becomes, what does the rest of Europe do with Cabral's discovery of, hey, there's this magical new landmass. We don't know how big it is. We think it's an island, but we don't know. And what else might be out there? So I think instead of 1492, 1500-ish kind of becomes the starting gun, but it's less of an outright starting gun, because it's not just a pure isolated, let's not try to go around Africa, let's go west. It's a byproduct of let's go around Africa.
So here's a question I have.
Yeah.
Treaty of Tordesillas.
Yeah.
Treaty of Tordesillas is, I forget, around the early 1500s.
I think it's early 1500s.
Which basically is the Pope drawing a line on a map and declaring everything to the east of this is going to be Portuguese, i.e., mainly their colonies in
Africa and Brazil.
By the way, great throwback to the episode we just got done recording about the end of this Portuguese empire.
Yep.
And everything west of it is going to be Spanish. The first question I have is, does this still happen? Do you have the Pope coming in and saying this? Because the other thing I'm thinking about is, hey, look at the people who look at the other, the other players in this, the English and the French.
Yes, who are Protestant, or about
Yeah.
to be Protestant.
About to be Protestant. They are not
Actually,
Protestant.
the treaty of Tordesillas actually happens earlier than we would think, and it happens, I think, pretty much as a direct consequence of Columbus's discovery. That happens in 1494, and
okay.
before that, we have the Bulls of Donation, which which what the Treaty of Tordesillas basically came to supersede. That happened in 1493, and that granted certain territories to Portugal and Spain, the two main exploratory nations at this point. So I think because of just how much of a direct cause and effect Columbus's discovery was for these things to happen, I don't really personally think, because there's no Spanish Italian who was hired by the Spanish that actually ended up finding more land in the West. It's just the Portuguese, as Dylan accidentally pointed out, the Portuguese finding this territory that may or may not be an island. We don't really know, sort of thing. In our timeline, we have a English explorer who he's actually Italian, but he's also a hired gun for the English, John Cabot or Giovanni Caboto.
Giovanni Caboto.
Giovanni Caboto. And
these people really know I have a mute button.
So he ends up finding, we don't know exactly for sure, but probably somewhere in Newfoundland or Labrador, somewhere in Canada. But again, that happens as a direct consequence of Columbus's discovery. Yeah. So if we just kind of assume that the English are still going to be one of the first to try it again, I think they're probably one of the biggest possible options still, especially given their maritime prowess. But I don't know, gentlemen, do you think that they're going to be the first ones?
Well, so if we say, just for the sake of convenience, I guess, that Cabral discovers South America in 1500, Cabot's original expedition was in 1497. So at minimum, that doesn't happen when it happens. It has to happen later.
Yeah, but I think that then there could be an incentive for them to.
Well, and so that's where I'm going. I think, what if, because Henry VIII hasn't even married Catherine of Aragon yet. That's not going to happen for almost 10 years. So Henry is still Catholic. So what if Cabot finds Newfoundland, corroborates that there is at least, if it's not the same landmass, there's at least another landmass to the west. Maybe the Treaty of Tordesillas, still between two Catholic countries,
is a north-south line.
It's a north-south line,
or it's between England and Portugal on some undetermined east-west line, which gets really interesting.
That gets really fascinating.
Once Henry VIII decides to do his thing, when he doesn't have to care about the papal treaty anymore. But I fast forward down the road a little bit. But maybe I think some kind of treaty, assuming the Catholic countries, which as far as I know, all of them are still Catholic, assuming everybody
have not been nailed yet. There are no Protestants.
Yeah, actually, that's right.
So
I was thinking through the timeline in my head. Yeah.
So it's going to be a treaty. It's probably not Tordesillas, because Tordesillas is in Spain, but it's going to be a treaty of somewhere.
Treaty of Lisboa, Treaty of Manchester, Treaty of London.
And this is also interesting because it gets, and this is kind of an aside, I don't know if it really goes to anything, but this is also an interesting kind of aside to, the old treaty for England. The Americans have our old treaty between England and the United States. The British and the English have their own version between England and Portugal.
It is the longest alliance.
Yeah, I was going to say.
I think in history, the longest long-standing. The longest continuous.
There's been interruptions to it, but yeah.
Yeah. But so let's say maybe that it is, whether it's north-south or east-west, the treaty is between England and Portugal.
By the way, this predates this, as I understand it.
What predates what?
The English-Portuguese treaty.
It does. It goes back to like the late 1200s, I think, or the 1300s.
Yeah, it was like 1380 something, yeah.
Yeah, so this could be seen as just kind of another natural extension of that. And then that gets kind of interesting into, okay, what happens inevitably? At least the French, maybe not the Spanish, for reasons that I'm going to go into here in just a second. The French are at the very least going to still try and get in on this bag. The Spanish are in kind of a weird place because Columbus does his thing in 1492. Isabella dies. Queen Isabella of Spain, actually of Castile, dies in 1504, leaving Ferdinand of Spain, actually of Aragon, which is a complete legally separate country at this point, the sole king with no wife. Long story short, in our timeline, Isabella's daughter Joanna kind of sort of becomes the Queen of Castile in law, but not really in fact. Ferdinand still rules until Joanna's son, Charles, begins the union of the kingdoms of Austria and Spain and completely degenerates any notion that the Spanish will
Also-
ever have of what a chin looks like.
Talk about Joanna. She's insane.
Yes. Well, debatable, because
Okay.
Ferdinand probably had a no small part in the depiction of her as insane because he
Okay.
didn't want her around. But what I'm getting at is, so if the North American continent gets discovered in 1500, Ferdinand and Isabella have 4 years to get an expedition organized, planned, and put together. That's probably not going to happen, which means that Spanish exploration of the New World is going to happen while, or if at all, while Ferdinand is no longer legally, politically, maritally united with the Kingdom of Castile. But Ferdinand's an ambitious guy. It's right after this, actually in, I think, 1504, 1505, that he takes Naples from France. So Ferdinand is trying to make power plays still. So what if Portugal has just discovered this whole new world thing? What if Ferdinand, instead of trying to go after Castile, decides, and this is like a full-on Game of Thrones thing that I'm starting to lay out. Ferdinand needs a wife. John II of Portugal dies in like 1498, I think. And his wife doesn't remarry. In our timeline, the long and the short of it, John II's wife, Eleanor, which again, Middle Ages, everybody's John, everybody's Eleanor, everybody's Henry. It gets confusing. Eleanor
So many
never remarries.
Jones and Joannes.
It's so bad. But Eleanor never remarries. Her brother is who ends up getting the Portuguese crown. Partially because she won't swear at one point. Eleanor's brother is an heir at one point. He then has a kid who actually becomes the heir. But at one point, her brother doesn't have kids, and so Eleanor is the actual heir. She decides not to swear the oath, proclaiming her basically functionally what the French kingdom's Dauphin is in Portugal. So maybe Ferdinand decides to go after Eleanor because she's still in her 30s. She could still have kids. And so Ferdinand could, instead of trying to go after the New World, he could decide to tie his rope to trying to tie the House of Trastamara into the Kingdom of Portugal, because they're the ones who are on the up and up right now with all these colonies in Africa, a route to the Indies, whatever this thing is going on in Portugal. Whether he actually has kids or not, it's at least possible. But what if Ferdinand ties his horse to Portugal and Castile, still under Joanna, is now kind of on the out and out, and the Habsburgs somehow end up with this territory in Spain that's between basically a rock and a hard place of these two united kingdoms that are looking like they're going to be the big kids on the block. Just an interesting idea as we go forward.
So first, you're saying that when Isabel dies,
Yeah, 1504.
Ferdinand has to give up that territory?
Well, he does. He's not the monarch. He's only the monarch by virtue of his marriage to Isabella.
Okay.
So once he is a bachelor, he has de facto rule because he's been on the throne, but he doesn't have any legal claim to it. That is one of the reasons why Isabella's daughter Joanna was, I'm going to generously use the phrase, portrayed as insane, because Ferdinand didn't want her in the picture so he could keep power.
He wanted to be able to keep control there.
Exactly.
I think we've talked about this a little bit before, and by the way, this probably explains what is likely to be the episode arc. They don't know what I'm talking about yet. They will. I just look at this from a more real politic, like power perspective of, hey,
Yeah.
Ferdinand does not want to give up this territory. By the way,
Yeah.
Spain has a ton, like I talked about earlier, a ton of trained troops. Portugal doesn't. And if Portugal starts getting a little big for its britches, you will very likely have an Iberian Union of some sort.
Okay.
I mean, that's what I was thinking in the pre-discussion as well, is this just seems to me like some form of Iberian Union. And Portugal has the maritime prowess that Spain doesn't have, and Spain has the military prowess that Portugal lacks. So to me, it just seems like, a match made in heaven at this point with a perfect intersection of windows.
Okay, no, I'm talking about
monarchs.
Spain invading Portugal, by the way.
Yeah.
Spain invading and occupying Portugal and taking what they want. Let's not dress
Okay.
this up in any kind of perfect match. No, this is
The world will learn of our peaceful ways by force.
And it's
Obligatory
not it's,
Futurama reference.
and so my idea of Ferdinand trying to jump in and marry the Dowager Queen of Portugal is not incompatible, because at this point,
I don't think it's incompatible.
all three of these royal houses have been like the Lannisters, marrying in and out of each other for so long that they're only like 2 steps removed from the 1700s Habsburgs. Like
From
nobody
becoming
actually knows.
Habsburgs. Yeah.
Exactly.
But
Yeah.
so here's the question I have, which I think is really interesting. One, if we delay this and if we have a Portuguese discovery of America, and they don't start extracting the gold the way the Spanish do. One, what's the name? What's the family name of Ferdinand?
It's the House of Trastamara.
Trastamara. Is that as attractive a match for the Habsburgs?
Well, it's not that it's an attractive match. It's that Isabella's daughters, because she was married to Henry of Habsburg. So, I don't know. That's interesting. I mean, I think they were already married by the time all this kicks off. So,
okay,
you have the Henry VIII style, how do I get rid of my wife kind of thing. But, I mean, when is that trouble to medieval rule?
You're coming around to it. You're actually coming around to
yeah.
politics.
Yeah.
But here's the other question. If Spain, if the new Iberian Union has pushed this kind of window far enough into the future when they have the Americas, that they don't have.
Because we have to remember, most of English colonization, most of French colonization in our timeline is not until the French kind of get into it in the 1540s, but the English aren't until the 1560s.
Yeah, it's a good
like
deal
it's
later.
Francis Drake, 1560s, 1570s at the earliest.
At the earliest,
because Jamestown's not until like almost 1590.
No,
Jamestown was.
Oh no, you're right. You're right.
Yeah.
No, something happened in 1585 for the English, but I can't remember.
I think that's Roanoke.
Anyway. Yes, that's what it is.
So Roanoke,
1585.
Yeah.
So either way, we're talking like 60, 70 years
and
behind the 8 ball.
Well, I think one of the things that I was going to mention when we talked about kind of an English exploration of North America is this.
Mm-hmm.
The footprint and what's going on back in the old country.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's very, you can know that there's islands out here, but I think what happens, one of the reasons, especially British colonization, takes off the way it does is the Protestant Reformation, the Civil War, kind of harkening a little bit back to the Cromwell episode we did. If you don't have, and don't worry, I've got something, I'm working on something that I'm going to come back to. If you don't have all of the changes that happen in England, do you have just enough bodies that they want to export?
That's a big deal. And I think also a decent part of it too is because, like, in our timeline, Spain has conquered the Mayans, conquered the Incas, and so the English are like, oh my gosh, like, we got to do something, now, especially that they're mortal enemies and they're on completely different sides of the Christian spectrum. That's a huge part of why, they want to book it out west too. In this timeline, we have a much more scattered understanding of what is in the West to begin with. And as Dylan mentioned in the pre-podcast, Portugal has kind of this chokehold between Brazil and their African holdings to get to the East. And I mean, as we know in history, a lot of what ended up happening with British exploration is because, and colonization is because they wanted spices in their tea. And so, and this was an idea that I thought of as well. I have like kind of two main ideas that I want to throw out, but this is the first one that I also thought about in the pre-podcast. And that is, if we have this chokehold by Portugal between Brazil and Africa, and a very loose understanding of what's going on in the West, plus less of an incentive to actually get out to the West, I think that there is, and I said this towards the beginning of the episode, there's more of an emphasis towards the Eastern routes and the Eastern ways to India. So we're at a really interesting inflection point in history as well, with what became much more prominent later on down the line, and that is with the Suez area, or Egypt. 1492 was a pretty bad year for the ruling Mamluk dynasty in Egypt. Essentially, imagine having a bunch of the ruling class old geezers that are running things. The only worst thing you can get than having a bunch of old guys ruling everything and having a bunch of money, piled up in their accounts, is having most of them die within a few months because of a plague.
I'm actually picturing like the early 80s Soviet Union, where
yeah. Yeah, exactly. So
plague just, borscht, but go on, and vodka.
Right, yeah. I love that, man. But we basically there's yet another sweet spot window of time here, because we're talking about a lot of like just how 1492 and these windows of time of opportunity with a lot of different dynasties and people moving here and there. Well, I think this is also presenting another very interesting window of time for a country or certain countries to start meddling in the affairs of an incredibly weakened Egypt, especially with the Ottoman Empire in the neighborhood. And in our timeline, the Ottomans eventually take over this area. I think that I'll cut to the chase. I think that there is a much earlier enterprise and seeking out on the part of France to actually find another Eastern route that can completely cut out and circumnavigate around the Portuguese altogether. Now, I mentioned in the group chat here on the Zoom call, there's a very nerdy reason why I think this is particularly the case. But also, Chris, I won't not give you credit on this as well. You basically kind of blew out of the water my other suggestion for who might be wanting to interfere here. So this is part of your brainchild as well. But my super nerdy reason is because, militarily speaking, not only are the Mamluks down on their luck, but this is kind of the beginning of development of certain kinds of like technology and warfare with muskets and that sort of thing. The Egyptians mainly still relied on archers, very highly trained archers. And in the early days of musketry, bows and arrows were actually more effective, because, the technology wasn't there yet on the muskets. You didn't have to rely, they were more portable. They had better aim, so on and so forth, reasons why archers were still better. But there is one very important thing that Western European countries, and particularly France, have a massive advantage in over the Egyptians, and that's mobile artillery. Swords and bows and arrows can't do very much against cannonballs, flying hunks of steel just crashing through. So I think the French see blood in the water. They see the Mamluks on the decline, and they see the Portuguese with a choke point. They realize now is the time, before the Ottomans get in, before anybody else could possibly get in. They want to grab that bag and possibly have an Eastern route to the Indies. What are your thoughts on that, gentlemen?
That's really interesting if you account for the fact that if Ferdinand, after Isabella dies, goes more towards Portugal, that probably means he never goes to war with France over Naples. So French Naples is still a thing, meaning that the French don't have to cross the entire Med. They can hop across Italy, and basically they at least have someplace to resupply, so they can cut their actual invasion fleet distance in half.
That's huge.
And plus
Also,
the Portuguese.
there's a bit of a tradition of the French being the guardians of Christians in the Holy Land.
Especially, after the Crusades,
and we got
all
the
of that.
Crusades. We got Joan of Arc acting under divine providence in the 100 Years' War. Another Joan to throw in here.
Dang it, there's so many. Well, and so there's an interesting, if you look at this and you think, okay, well, what if the Mamluks, who are Muslim, get attacked by the French, who are Catholic Christian? Wouldn't the Ottomans come to their defense? You would think so.
Question,
but
because
so the Mamluks are Shia, the Ottomans are Sunni, so they might look disfavorably on a Catholic incursion into Egypt, but they're not going to be inclined to do.
I don't think
the
inclined
Mamluks any
to.
favors, both from a religious and an economic perspective.
Like all of this kind of starts with the fall of Constantinople. And the Ottomans being, by the way, not cutting off India. In any way.
No, because the Mamluks still had the Suez.
Just taxing trade to India. I don't know what the Ottomans can do about the Portuguese, but there is something they can do about the French.
Well,
so I don't know
the Ottomans tried to do things about the Portuguese and they failed spectacularly.
I don't know if it's in terms of the Ottomans supporting the Mamluks or them just using this disruption to try and move in and extend their own influence into the area.
Yeah,
I think because I don't think the Ottomans are necessarily they see the writing on the wall for the Mamluks, I think, and I think that they're gonna want to take advantage of this. I mean, they're not going to want to tick off France invading. If anything, they would partner with France. I would think.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. They might get some kind of territorial
because, and let's also keep in mind too the Muslim world's understanding of this. Like Spain is basically doing mop-up duty at this point, kicking out the Moors. I was trying to feverishly Google what side the Moors are on, like what camp, whether they're Sunni or Shia, to see another interesting angle on that. But I don't think that really matters for this explanation.
Honestly, historically, I'm not even sure if the Sunni Shia thing matters.
I don't think it even mattered to them. Yeah. But anyway, case in point, we're probably going to get roasted by somebody in the comments.
Well,
anyway,
it matters a little bit, mostly just because the Mamluks currently control Medina. So what I'm imagining is maybe if the French go after the Mamluks to take Alexandria, Cairo, the Suez, the Ottomans talk to them and say, "Hey, look," kind of from a realpolitik sense, because the Ottomans and the Mamluks
have been good
fighting over the economic ability of the Mamluks to control the Suez and have another avenue for the spice trade. The Ottomans, the Sunni Shia thing is not. It's not a thing, but it's not a thing. Like it is still a at least back of the mind concern for a expansionist kind of, and not megalomaniacal, but
I think
expansionist series of Caleb's. But
the base fact is this: there are almost no Mamluks left. In terms of a hierarchical structure and the plague that wipes out most of them.
Yeah,
like
but
basically
the
imagine.
Ottomans, yeah, they're going to want to take, if they see the writing on the wall and they see the French are going to take the Suez, they say, hey, that's fine. Give us Damascus and Syria and Medina. Because you don't care about it for the spice trade.
Exactly. I was thinking that could happen.
If you just take the Suez and Egypt, all we want, we'll acquiesce to your control of the Suez. We won't fight you over basically invading a Muslim power. If you at least let us, not necessarily, don't give us control, but don't get mad at us if we go finish up the Mamluks to take Medina and some of the traditional Arabic cities of import so that we can reunite them with the Islamic caliphate, which is how the Ottomans still style themselves.
Are the
No.
French going to do that when completely? Because I think there's an economic incentive for them to do that. But are the French going to necessarily do that when, as Chris noted, French often portray themselves as like the defenders of Christendom? They're next door to Jerusalem.
I think they take this deal, but it sets up so many future problems.
I was going to say it sets up
Exactly.
a lot of problems.
Because I think both sides realize this is, to quote Foch, this is not a peace, but an armistice that will last 20 years.
I think so.
Chris just looked at me. He was like, really? You're quoting World War I at me?
Yeah, well, I think that sets up a really interesting thing in terms of like what the French are trying to do. I think one other thing. Oh, Chris, before, because I'm going to go on a totally different tangent. So
I have a
hop
bomb I'm
in.
going to throw in.
Go
Okay,
for it.
do it.
Because I do look at the clock and realize it's about that time of the episode.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I think we can get more. What I'm about to do, I think, is pretty big.
All right.
We've talked about our traditional empires. We left somebody out. That's the Netherlands.
I was wondering if we were going to go there.
I've been thinking about the Dutch.
I was wondering.
I have a couple of pages about the Dutch during the Age of Discovery during this time. There's some very interesting things happening a little after this point, because if I remember at this point in the 1500s, the Dutch are not even recognized as separate by Spain yet.
No, well, in this timeline, they're not owned by Spain. They're owned by Austria.
Mm-hmm.
And here's the other thing. The entire 80 Years' War,
Yeah.
the Dutch
Oh.
independence struggle from Austria was funded by what?
Tulips?
The New World.
Yeah.
All of that
Yeah.
gold they took out of
Yep.
Mexico and of Peru
Yeah.
funded all of the Counter-Reformation, funded the 30
Mhm.
Years' War, which, again, that's a huge thing. Does Germany become a thing?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
For the
No, that's
purposes of
massive.
this, the Habsburgs do not have, even if there is some dynastic union between the Iberian Union and the whatever, they don't have these
Masses of
Train
gold and silver. Yeah.
gold coming
Mhm.
in to pay for mercenaries to try and keep the Dutch down. Also, hey, this whole thing about what we are thinking about in terms of where they were trying to get initially, Dutch East Indies. They
Yeah,
wind up in charge of
Yeah.
all of Indonesia.
Mhm.
They are very
Yep.
successful. And
Yep.
if they're independent earlier, I think what you might wind up seeing is maybe England starts in North America,
Mhm.
has some claims in North America. The Dutch
I think the Dutch have
go
a much,
Protestant.
yeah,
Yeah.
because they're the
You-
hotbed of Calvinism, Dutch
You
Reformed.
do not have the funding in Central Europe to put down Protestantism.
The Dutch uprising. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So one, the Dutch become a thing. Two, the Dutch probably start messing with
I think
the
we could see-
Iberian Union.
we
And
could
so
see.
maybe the Dutch
yeah.
take the role of the England,
Well, and maybe
Well, wait, okay,
because
wait a
about
second.
we're going to talk about
Did the Dutch,
another
did the
classic
Dutch take?
historical strategy game.
Yeah.
Maybe it's the Dutch in Sid Meier's Pirates.
that's where I was
Hey.
going to go. Instead
Yeah.
of the Dutch East Indies, it's the Dutch West
Dutch
Indies.
West Indies.
Por qué
Well,
no los dos?
this is what I'm
Because-
thinking.
Or
Well,
¿Por qué
because
no los
don't-
dos?
Well, I'm thinking because if you have an independent Netherlands, one,
Mhm.
they don't have a, they have to worry about having troops close to home in case the Spanish and or the Habsburgs try things again. So they don't.
Okay.
I just wonder about the logistics of them trying to do a whole lot of stuff
okay.
east of the Suez. But if the Portuguese are focused on the south, the Spanish aren't in the picture, and the English are kind of in, Canada, and the French are in the Suez, well, that leaves the Caribbean, Dutch Florida, maybe? Even
I
up
mean,
the
this is what
eastern
I was
seaboard.
thinking. I was thinking the Dutch could take the place of possibly, and I'm not going to say completely because, obviously I don't think there's
Yeah.
enough logistical manpower for this, but I could see a possibility where we have the the Dutch conquistadors instead of the conquistadors, possibly. I think
Ooh.
they're going to be more focused on the North and the Caribbean, what we call
I
the
think-
West Indies.
I
Just
think
kind of
there's
based
a-
on our timeline. The Dutch take Manhattan, like in
Yeah,
our timeline.
I just think
So-
there's a better word for it. The Holland Conquistadors.
Okay. I want to
No.
see Chris make art of like Spanish
Yeah, Chris is-
soldiers with
Chris
Spanish
is
soldiers
vetoing us hard.
with wooden clogs. I don't know.
Tulips coming out of the muskets.
Tulips coming out of the muskets. Yeah, I don't know.
Hmm.
But anyway, I'll let Chris put the kibosh on this idea before I get to like the second main
Well,
idea
okay, by the way, guys,
that I wanted to
just
throw
wait
in.
till you see the episode art. Like,
Oh, I
it-
can't wait.
I can't wait. This is going to be good.
Chris already has ideas. So, but I guess that ties into this whole kind of, because this has been probably not the episode that listeners would expect when they hear what if Columbus didn't discover North America. Because truth be told, we have focused probably more in the detail about Europe and what this does to Europe than really
really the
the
Mediterranean.
specific, the
the
specific
Mediterranean
development of the New World.
And this is where I wanted to go with my last idea is the main thing that people usually focus on with the Columbus kind of centric forks are what happens to the Native Americans, what happens to the indigenous folks. And that's kind of what I wanted to throw in here more towards the end is I've been listening to this old podcast series. I'll give a shout out to them. Counterfactual Canuck or Counterfactual Canuck, however you pronounce that. And they had an episode on episode 2 where they talked about how we just kind of assume that in the absence of European colonization, or in the case of this timeline that we're developing, move down a few years, kick the can down the road a few years of European colonization. But a lot of us kind of assume as like Eurocentric, perspectives that, the Native Americans would just kind of have their societies develop in a similar manner to how European nations developed. And it's a very Eurocentric view. And I think that the podcaster there, Counterfactual Canuck, makes an excellent point that we probably shouldn't just assume that, the Native Americans in the absence of Europeans would develop the same as Europe did and be able to create their own version of Wakanda.
Yeah.
Like, just, and it's harder for us as, all three of us on the show are, European, various European ethnicities. So it's kind of hard of us to possibly consider things from a different point of view. But I think we should attempt to do that. Because, what we see in our timeline is we do see certain like Indian confederacies that arise, and stuff like the 7 Years' War between the British and the French, the Iroquois, all these kind of things. But that's kind of in direct response to, and because the European power players are trying to get the natives on their side to get their goals of what they want. In absence of that, right? And if we assume that the Columbian Exchange is delayed a little bit, is maybe called the Cabot Exchange, who knows? But if let's assume, for sake of argument, that the Mayans, the Incans, and also the North American, tribes are not as heavily impacted by diseases. They have a little bit more, I would say, of a fighting chance, and maybe we can call Portuguese, Spanish, a combination of Portuguese maritime knowledge and Spanish, artillery and whatever starts kind of wandering its way up north. What if we have, a Mayan civilization or, some sort of North American Indian tribes that are actually able to, for a time, successfully fight back against European colonizers?
I think I talked about
where would
that.
where would that lead?
Where it's like, if they have a chance to adjust to I'm going to just call it the smallpox shock.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not hit immediately by settlers, troops, all of that. And I think this scenario may lead to that because what we talked about is, kind of a Cabot North America. But it's not backed up by the immigration waves.
Yeah.
So that introduces these pathogens. Fun thing about pathogens, it only takes one contact. Once it's in their system, it's all over.
Yeah.
And I think this introduces it early, and it gives them a chance to recover from that shock.
Yeah.
So like I talked about a little bit earlier, I don't know what form it takes, but I think they're much stronger polities meeting the settlers of North America at the water side.
I think this is what ends up happening. I think, and I haven't fully developed this, necessarily in my head. And Chris, I'll throw in the link to that episode because I made a couple of references to it at this point. That episode that I listened to that gave me these ideas talked about what if there were no European settlers, no European contact at all, how, Canada and some of the other Indian tribes would develop. I think that's a very interesting concept. But, in this alternate timeline, we're talking about moving it down a few years. What I think possibly ends up happening is we have this sort of idea. I see a historical parallel to spheres of influence in China. And this is, of course, kind of before and contiguous with the concept of, the British and the Opium Wars and everything along those lines. But you don't see in China, to the same degree that happened in the Americas and in Africa, especially, where the Europeans basically just came in and took over everything. We have more of what I would argue is, a partnership, right? I think if we have stronger Native American polities, I think they are more than happy. They are more than willing to say, hey, you know what? You guys got a lot of things that we want. We also happen to have a lot of gold and a lot of things that you want. But in this alternate timeline, there are no Spanish conquistadors coming and taking it by force and by germs.
Well,
it's something that's bartered for. It's something that's traded for.
So honestly, a little bit more like how French Canada developed.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was going, because I think, Evan, you've got a really good point about the possibilities on the development of Native American civilizations with a greater ability to adjust to smallpox. Especially
the Dutch aren't going to buy Manhattan for a few beads. Let's just put it that way. That's not happening.
No, but you have to remember, there are still, especially in North America, you've got the Aztec and the Inca in Peru and Mexico, but you also have these Mississippi mound cultures of various stripes, like Cahokia, which is right next to St. Louis on the Mississippi River. The last archaeological records that they can find are from the mid 1300s. So this is not that far removed from significant Native American cultures in North America. And where I'm really going is, with a different colonization of North and South America between the players, but also the areas, the Portuguese, assuming they take the role kind of the Spanish a little bit, they're probably going to have some form of the Spanish encomienda system. So much harsher, South America is probably going to develop, colonially speaking, much closer to what it would be in our timeline, where it's military occupation, slavery, whether it's in fact or in some kind of legal fiction, fixation to the land, resource extraction. North America is going to be very different.
Yeah.
One, because the Portuguese are going to be in South America, but two, because of the players that are in North America. If the English are kind of taking over Newfoundland, Canada area, they're going to kind of do the same thing that the French did, which is all resources, hunting, trading, maybe a little bit more of outright outpost colonization, but not much.
Mm-hmm.
And the Dutch are going to kind of do this weird thing in the middle in the Caribbean, in New Orleans. Dutch New Orleans is just an idea that I can't get out of my head now. And kind of so I think the end game, once you get into this, the 17 and the 1800s, what you're going to see is you're going to see a quote unquote colonial Americas that are going to be very divergent from they're going to be much more farther apart than they were between North and South America in our timeline, where Spain had all of South America and up into Mexico. I think there's going to be, at least culturally and from a colonial economics perspective, a greater demarcation somewhere in Central America between how things are done in North America, Cabot land, whatever you want to call it, versus what Portuguese South America looks like.
I think you might, just for economic climactic reasons, and we've touched on this from coming from the other perspective, but I think it's interesting to look at it from this perspective. You might see the Portuguese model having success in the American South.
Yeah, I can see that.
We talked about the South expanding into Latin America, but we've never looked at it.
Latin America expanding south.
coming up that way.
Yeah, and especially if the Dutch are in the Caribbean, I can see them taking more to the Caribbean, the sort of Portuguese / in our timeline, kind of the Haitian French economic model, which does look really attractive in the South. But ironically enough, I think that gets into like, okay, what is to mix a metaphor here? What does the colonial Mason-Dixon line look like between this sort of Caribbean resource extraction at all costs kind of area versus kind of, I'm thinking more like the Mexican desert and kind of Louisiana and Canadian North America, where it's much more like, classic French. We want rivers, we want beaver hats, and we want wood. And we're happy to wheel and deal with whoever we got to do to get.
Exactly. And I think it's really interesting to think about, as another possible implication of this timeline. Like we tend to think of, certain Indian people groups and Native American tribes as being from certain areas, that they are now, but that's not where they were. They were, and you can see a lot of this in various points in American history. They were forced there; they were forcibly removed. Yeah. So the areas that we, in our modern understanding, think of as being like Cherokee, Chickasaw, Seminole, Choctaw, Muskogee areas, that's not actually their original tribal lands. So if we have, let's for example, just take the Seminoles. We have the Seminoles in as Dylan puts it, a possible Dutch Florida. And there's no Seminole Wars because the underlying causes of the Seminole Wars aren't happening. Well, what would happen if these Native American tribes are in fact never displaced? And, okay, maybe there's a French style model. Maybe there is a certain degree of subjugation involved. But honestly, I don't see a Spanish model happening, conquistadors happening. I think it's, really what we're talking about here is a much more equitable, as I guess, equitable as it can get between what we think of from our Eurocentric perspective as, the conquering colonial European powers versus in our timeline, what we see as, all of these native groups that just fell, by the wayside because of guns, germs, and steel. So, I think that's a really interesting world that we've created for ourselves.
And in honor of college football season starting next week, if we don't have the Seminole Wars, we don't have the Florida State Seminoles, and college football, not just for that, but for a whole host of differences, would look very different.
Yeah, we also don't have the Sooners in Oklahoma. We don't have the Jayhawks in Kansas.
I'm telling you, college football mayhem.
The Washington Redskins probably stay the Washington Redskins.
Do you have
no, the Washington Tulips, because the Dutch land in the Potomac.
Yeah. Have
or the Washington Clogs.
Well,
we're all assuming that they're a single polity on the entire Eastern.
Yeah, exactly, and there probably isn't. That's a whole nother section.
I am going to sports implications. I kind of want to come back to this.
I think this would be an interesting one to follow up on.
I just had a realization.
Oh. What?
So if you have multinational colonies in North America that all presumably at some point eventually down the line may or may not get independence, American sports like football and baseball, when they hold the Super Bowl and the World Series, may actually be multinational events. So they really will be the World Championships.
But they really would be.
What does that do to the popularity of soccer? Do you have soccer taking over the southern United States since they are an extension of Portugal?
Maybe.
I could possibly see that. I mean, we have in Latin America, soccer slash what most people call real football, is like literally, central to their entire national identity, cultural sense of identity. I could easily see that being something that's more of a thing in what we would call the Southern United States under a more Portuguese model.
All right, I've got it. So both sides, the best American football team and the best football team in the Americas meet once a year in Mexico City, or whatever they call it. And there's 2 games played. There's a game of American football and a game of worldwide football. And we see who's better at which one.
No.
And it's the Copa Americana.
No. It would be Tenochtitlan. Because
Sorry,
that's
you're
literally
right.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And just to throw everybody off, they play a game of Aussie rules.
I was going to say, yeah, rugby.
Or what was the Mayan sport? Because I remember studying.
The hoop ball.
Yeah.
The Mayans,
that could be a progenitor of basketball.
The Mayans are gone.
So basketball becomes huge.
The Mayans are gone, but the Aztecs may not.
Well, the Aztecs are probably not. So I think basketball develops and becomes the national sport of the Aztecs. And hey, we have the San Diego State Aztecs. There you go.
It all comes together.
It all comes together. All right, gentlemen. I'm going to throw one last, just kind of silly, historical.
That wasn't the
Reddit
past
post.
5 minutes wasn't.
Oh man. But I'm just going to throw in one last thing here. Something that I found when researching this topic was a very, very silly alternate history map of what if Columbus went really, really, really fast. He had some sort of secret alien tech or something that caused the Santa Maria to be able to fly at 0.996 times the speed of light. I'm asking Chris, this is an episode where I asked Chris to throw a ton of things into show notes. So this is another thing I'll ask him to throw in there just for fun. Basically what the impact crater of that would be and just how a new ice age would start as a result of Christopher Columbus crash landing into the Bahamas or into Cuba. I forget where that map.
Yeah, the thing
the
thing that went through my mind looking at that map, I'm like, isn't that where they think the dinosaur comet hit?
I was going to say, what if we increase the speed past the speed of light and Columbus travels back 65 million years to kill the dinosaurs?
Christopher Columbus, the Santa Maria just is actually the meteor that hit the Yucatan. I want to say that maybe I haven't.
Yeah, it's the Yucatan Peninsula.
I believe it's the Yucatan is where they think that the asteroid hit that killed all the dinosaurs. But anyway, I just want to throw that silly thing in here at the end. Anything else that you guys want to bring up before we bring things to a close?
I only have one random bit of trivia to fast forward all the way back to the beginning when we were talking about who colonized what when. So there's a really interesting, completely unfounded theory of an alternate reason why the Americas are called the Americas. And it is not Amerigo Vespucci, which is what everybody thinks of. Supposedly, according to this, I don't want to call it a conspiracy theory, but there's not really any evidence to support it. So I'm going to all but call it a conspiracy theory. Supposedly, a rumored financier of Henry Cabot's expedition in 1497 to discover the New World was a man named Richard Americ. And supposedly, that is where the name America comes from. Because
America is, and I don't think I mentioned this in the earlier in the episode, but I don't think America is called America.
No, I don't think so either. But
I don't think so. It is at all.
I'm sure our non-English listeners will be very surprised to hear, and I'm sorry to offend our English listeners because I know we have a few, but I'm sure our non-English listeners will be very shocked to hear that there is a reason for the English to take credit for just about everything.
Indeed. All right. Well, thank you all for listening to what ended up taking a very, very different tact than I think most of you probably thought we would take this.
I didn't even think we would go this way.
I didn't even think we would necessarily go this way. But as always, A Fork in Time Mobile, Mr. Buck, Mr. Holzmer, and Mr. Coppola's wild ride. The ride never ends over here. So thank you all so much for tuning in. As always, we got our Discord. we have our Patreon as well. If you particularly enjoy these episodes and would like to contribute, we got that going too. Yeah, we're always open to feedback. So drop us a line over at the Discord if you enjoyed this or disagreed, or in the Spotify comments or whatever platform of choice that has comments. Thank you so much for listening. And if you happen to stumble across a fork in time, what do you think we should do with that?
Take it.
Take it. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.